This is Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, and we're talking about the respiratory system. We ended off talking about the alveoli, so that's where I want to pick back up. The alveoli, this is the only place the gas exchange happens. So all along the larynx, the pharynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, nowhere in there is there any gas exchange happening. So it's not till we get down to the alveolar ducts, which move into the alveolar sacs, into the alveoli, and that is the key place. That is where we're now going to focus, and that's where the gas exchange actually happens. Here you can see the divisions of the respiratory tract is moving down, and if you think about the lung, it's kind of almost like a spongy tissue, because there is a lot of empty space inside the lungs because you want to fill it up with this oxygen, with these gases, in order to get them into the alveoli where they can exchange with the blood. These represent the alveoli or the alveolar sacs. So these spaces here. So notice the alveoli are surrounded by these cells, and these are very thin cells. These are epithelial cells, and they're simple squamous cells. So going clear back to the beginning of this class, if you remember, we talked about simple squamous. So simple meaning that there's a single layer, squamous meaning that they're very thin cells. And that's very important because, again, we're doing gas exchange here, and so what that means is that these cells surrounding the alveolar sacs, the oxygen in here is going to have to move across the layers of those cells in order to get to the capillaries. So here are the capillaries, and they're flowing around the alveolar sacs, and you can see the capillaries scattered throughout. Oxygen has to move through these cells and then through the cells and capillaries into the bloodstream in order to get to those red blood cells. So the thinner the cells, the fewer layers of cells, the faster we can get that oxygen through. And it's going to just simply diffuse. It's a simple diffusion into those. There's also these pores, and these alveolar pores are connections between the different alveoli. So for whatever reason, one of the passageways to a certain alveolar sac is clogged, then these passageways here between the alveoli allow the oxygen still to move between the different areas so that they can all be filled up. There's also some interesting cells in here. These green cells, these are interesting cells that their job is to produce surfactant, which is a type of soap, or maybe a better word is detergent, which is very important in helping these alveoli stay open. Premature babies, the reason that premature babies for a long time they couldn't survive is because they weren't able to produce surfactant. So our bodies don't start producing surfactant until very late in development, about the time we're ready to be born, so that our lungs will function. If you don't have any surfactant, then your lungs aren't going to inflate. You're not going to be able to get any oxygen inside your cells. They didn't know that. We didn't know that, or scientists didn't know that for a long time. But when this surfactant was discovered and its importance, that's what now allows, one of the major things that now allows us to help premature babies and allow them to continue developing and survive even when they're born long before they're ready. There's also macrophages, and these guys are just crawling around, and their job is to make sure that any bacteria, viruses, or things like that aren't getting into this area. So they're patrolling and making sure that there's only the air in here, there's nothing else, and they can pick up dust particles and things like that. So they're cleaning up our lungs, making sure that they're working well. Here you can see the picture of the movement between the alveoli and the capillaries. So here's our simple squamous cells of the alveoli. Here's our simple squamous cells of the capillaries, and here's our oxygen. It has to move through all these cell layers and then get to the red blood cell. And the red blood cell, this is where the oxygen is going to be carried. and then the CO2 is going to move the opposite way. It's going to be released from the blood into the alveolus, and then we're ready to exhale it. So now let's focus on this gas exchange and how breathing actually works. We can split it up into four main parts. The whole idea of respiration, respiring meaning to breathe, or the movement of air or gases, exchange of gases. We can split it up into four parts. The first one is called pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary referring to the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation, this is the actual act of breathing. So this is simply moving the air from the outside into our lungs. Once it gets into our lungs, then we have the external respiration. And we call this external respiration because even though it's inside our lungs, it's coming in contact with the external environment. So this is the outside of the inside of our body. And so we call this external respiration. So in external respiration, the oxygen is moving from the alveoli into the red blood cells. And at the same time, the carbon dioxide is leaving the blood and moving into the alveoli so it can be breathed out. So that's called external respiration. After that, we have respiratory gas transport, and then the transport simply means that we're moving that around the body. So the oxygen, again, it has to get to every cell in our body. In order to do that, we have to be able to transport it around our body. This is where the cardiovascular system comes in, because that is the pathway. It's called almost like a rail system, a train system that goes clear around our body. That's the way that the oxygen is going to move around our body. So the oxygen is loaded onto the red blood cells, and they travel along the cardiovascular system to all parts of the body. That's the transport. And then once they get to those cells, then we have the internal respiration. So internal because this is actually inside the body. This is where the capillaries and the cells come together, and the gas exchange is going to happen again. But in this case, now the oxygen is leaving the red blood cells and moving into the cells, and the CO2 is leaving the cells and moving into the blood. So we have these two places where respiration is happening, externally and internally. And each place it's happening opposite. So in the external respiration, oxygen into the blood, CO2 out of the blood. Internal respiration, CO2 into the blood, oxygen out of the blood. Alright, well let's now look at pulmonary ventilation. So we've seen the four different parts of respiration. Now we're going to focus on each of the steps here. So first we're going to look at pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation can be, again, this is pulling the air in, just simply bringing the air into your lungs and getting rid of the air from your lungs. And so there's basically two phases that we have here. The first is called inspiration, where you're bringing the air in, and expiration. Inspire and expire. So this is pretty simple, but something to point out here is that the way our lungs work is a passive system. Not necessarily that it doesn't take energy, but the flow of air is passive. And what I mean by that is we don't have to actively force air into our lungs. The way that we breathe is that we create a partial, kind of like a vacuum. We change the pressure, and as we change the pressure, the air naturally wants to flow into our lungs. So there's some organisms, so this isn't human anatomy physiology, but there are some organisms that actively push air into their lungs. So for example, frogs, when they breathe, so they pull air into their mouth, and then they have to force it down into their lungs. On the other hand, we simply expand our lungs, and we change the pressure in our lungs, and the air follows that change in pressure. And so as we go through this here, the rule to follow is that as the pressure changes, as the pressure goes down, the air is going to go towards the area of lower pressure. And that's true for inspiration, and that's also true for expiration. So for inspiration, there's another number of things that come into play. First of all, we have our diaphragm. So our diaphragm is key in changing the pressure in our lungs, because the way you change the pressure is to change the volume. So whenever you're working with a gas will always fill the container that it's in. It's like water, where you pour water into a cup, it's going to take the shape of that cup. But different from water, If you have a larger cup, the water's not going to expand to fill that whole cup. Water doesn't change volume as the space changes volume, but gas does. So if you have a larger cup, you pour gas in, and this is air, not gas like gasoline, but air gas. Gas fills the space, the volume that you give it. And this is, so if you think about blowing up a balloon, so as you blow up a balloon, it's going to expand, and the air is going to fill that whole space. And this is true for our lungs as well. So in order to pull the air into our lungs, we change the space that is there, and then the gas will fill that larger space. And then because there's the same amount of gas for a larger space, then the pressure is going to go down. So let's say, for example, our lungs are originally like this. As the diaphragm contracts, and as the ribs are moved by the intercostal muscles, we're going to expand the space available in the lungs. So the lungs expand, they're now bigger. The amount of air, let's say that there was 1 liter of air in this original lung. As we expand the lung, assuming that there's not air rushing in, we still have 1 liter of air, but we now have a larger space. So because we have a larger space, the same amount of air, the pressure inside this larger lung is now lower. We have changed the pressure. So what happens here is the diaphragm, to increase the size of the lungs, the diaphragm, when it contracts, it pulls down on the lungs. So as it pulls down on the lungs, that's what increases the space inside the lungs. So we have the diaphragm contracting, and that makes it shorter and flatter. So when the diaphragm is relaxed, it's kind of a bell-shaped muscle. When it contracts, it's going to flatten out. And as it flattens out, that's going to pull the lungs down. It's going to increase the space inside the lungs. While that is happening, we have the intercostal muscles between the ribs. So you have the external intercostal ribs. These intercostal muscles will also contract, and what that does is it pulls the rib cage up. So the lungs are being pulled down and increasing in size. The ribs are being pulled up. All of this comes together to increase the space available in the lungs. So you can see here, here's our full inspiration. So we've expanded that space. What this does is this causes the pressure to go down. And what we're dealing with here is the pressure outside, the air pressure outside your body versus the air pressure inside your lungs. So before you take a breath, before this inspiration happens here, the air pressure is equalized in your lungs versus the air pressure outside. As you contract your diaphragm, contract the intercostal muscles, as we increase this space, we've now lowered the pressure inside, which means that the outside pressure is greater than the inside pressure, which has gone down. So what the air is going to naturally do is it's going to flow towards that lower pressure. So that because there's more air pressure outside, the air naturally rushes into your lungs to fill that space until the pressure both inside and outside is then again equalized. Breathing out is the exact opposite. So notice here on the previous page in the full expiration, these lines here showed how large the ribs were when we expanded them. So notice how large. When we exhale, we're decreasing that space. So in this case, the diaphragm is going to contract, it's going to relax, So it goes from a flat position back to this kind of dome-shaped position. And as it relaxes, that's going to decrease the size of the lungs. And then the intercostal muscles will also relax, and that's going to drop the rib cage down. So both of these things together have decreased the space available in the lungs. So now the outside pressure will be less than the pressure on the inside. because we have created less space with the same amount of air, same amount of oxygen, same amount of gas, and so we've increased the pressure. And so the air wants to rush outside to try to equalize this pressure until you get to the point where the pressure inside and outside is equal. And that's how inspiration happens. That's how we breathe. So again, this is a passive system. Hopefully this makes sense to you. We're not forcing the air into our lungs. All we're doing is we're creating this decrease in pressure that is allowing that air to follow that pressure gradient. So the air is always going to go towards the lower pressure. This is the same thing we see. So if you watch the news, you like to watch the weather. They talk about high pressure systems and low pressure systems, and air is always going to move towards that lower pressure, from a higher to lower pressure. That's how we get. It depends on temperature and things like that, but that's how winds are created, as the air is moving to areas that have been evacuated by warmer air, so cold air will rush in, etc., etc. So very similar situation here in our lungs. So as we change the volume, that changes the pressure. Here's two little figures here that try to show this a little bit more, showing the actual pressure. So notice this top figure, we have pressure relative to atmospheric pressure. Or in other words, this is the pressure inside our lungs compared to the pressure in the outside, the atmospheric pressure. And here, down here, you see simply the volume of air as we're pulling that air in and pushing it back out. So over here we have inspiration, over here we have expiration. So we start at 0, meaning that the pressure on the inside our lungs, the pressure and the atmospheric pressure are the same. Then we're going to, the diaphragm is going to contract. It's going to increase that volume inside the lungs, and the intercostals will contract. And at this point, we've now increased the space inside our lungs, and so now the pressure on the inside our lungs is less than the pressure in the atmosphere. And so the air, so notice down here the volume of breath, so the air is going to follow that pressure gradient. So as we decrease that pressure in our lungs, suddenly the air comes rushing in, and as it rushes in, that equalizes the pressure so that we get back to the 0. So after we take all this air rushes in, we're back to the point where the pressure on the inside of our lungs and the atmospheric pressure are now the same again. So now as we expire, our diaphragm is going to relax. It's going to decrease the space in the lung. Intercostal muscles will relax. We've decreased the volume, and the pressure has gone up. So inside our lungs, we now have a greater pressure than we do in the atmospheric pressure. Because of that, the air is going to rush inside our lungs, and as it rushes inside our lungs, the pressure is going to go back till it is equalized, and that's where it's going to stop, where the pressure inside our lungs and the atmospheric pressure are the same. And there you go. That's how inspiration and expiration happen. Alright, let's watch a little video here showing the pressure gradients, the changes, so you can actually see this happening. One other thing I forgot to mention is about expiration. And in expiration, the diaphragm relaxes, the intercostal muscles relax, and then the lung tissue, it's elastic, so it naturally is going to kind of rebound back into its former size, and that's also important in expiration. So here we go. So here's our little video. So here's our lungs. So notice the diaphragm down below. So now it's contracting. Notice as it contracts, it decreases, it pulls down on these lungs. As this contracts, notice how the lungs are going to open up. So now at this point, this is inspiration. So our diaphragm is contracted. The pressure on the inside of the lungs is less than the pressure outside. So we have more pressure out here. So again, air is always going to follow that lower, it always wants to go towards the lower pressure. So in this case, we're going to want, the air wants to rush from the outside to the inside. And as it does that, the pressure is going to equalize. And we'll be back to the normal pressure gradient. And then we're going to go to an expiration. So as we expire, notice how the diaphragm relaxes and it moves back up. And that's going to, and at that point, when it does that, the pressure on the right here, so now our diaphragm has relaxed, the lungs are back to their former shape. Now the pressure inside the lungs is greater than the pressure outside. So we've decreased that volume, same amount of air, so we have more pressure on the inside, so the air all wants to go rushing out of the lungs back into the outside to try to equalize that pressure. And there you go, that's how we breathe. I'll play this one more time, and as we watch this, let me mention also the pleural membranes and their role in this as well. So obviously the diaphragm is important, the intercostal muscles is important. We already talked about the pleural membranes, the parietal and visceral pleural membranes, and there's a visceral space between the two membranes is filled with the fluid. And that space there has a negative pressure inside. So inside those pleural membranes, that space, there's low pressure, and what that does is it holds the visceral and the parietal membranes next to each other. Because of that negative pressure, it acts almost like a rubber band holding those two membranes together. And that's also important in inspiration and expiration, because the membranes, because they are next to the lungs, they hold the lung open, so that negative pressure keeps the lung from collapsing. And the way you can know this is true is if you were to puncture those membranes, and this happens in wounds, like if someone gets in a knife fight and happens to get knifed in the lung, and it goes through that pleural membrane, suddenly the lung's going to collapse. Also, people that break ribs, if you break a rib and it happens to puncture that membrane, suddenly your lung is collapsing because that pleural membrane is no longer holding that lung out. And so in order to reinflate that lung, you have to remove the air from that space, from that pleural space, and restore that negative pressure before the lung's going to be able to inflate and go back to how you were. So this is a little bit about the physiology of breathing.